When Worlds Collide left me with a very strange feeling, both overwhelmed and chilled to the bone. I still remember the images of earthquakes, giant waves swallowing entire cities, and the moment when people stood in front of the lottery boards silent as if they already understood that not everyone would be allowed on board. Back then, I thought I was simply watching a classic disaster film, but the more I revisit When Worlds Collide, the more I realise that what makes it terrifying doesn't lie entirely on the screen. It lies in what people don't have time to notice: a modern-day Noah's Ark forged from steel and the panic of the atomic age. Melting planets that were in reality nothing more than wax heated under lamps, and scenes of chaos that looked like acting but were actually real reactions because the sets were shaking so violently that the actors could only cling to one another to stay upright. And here are 20 strange facts you may never have known about. When Worlds Collide, 1951. 20. The modern Noah's Ark. There is a very small moment in When Worlds Collide that has always unsettled me. It's when the ship stands motionless on the launch platform, enormous, heavy, and utterly indifferent. Back then, I thought this is a vessel of salvation. Watching it again years later, I realised it looks more like a sentence than a rescue. Even before the first image appears, the film makes that clear. It opens with a quotation from Genesis. Not to plead with God, but to remind the audience that there was once a time when humanity was destroyed for believing it knew too much. It is the coldest warning in the entire film. George Powell never saw When Worlds Collide as pure science fiction. In his mind, it was the story of Noah's Ark retold by a century that had just emerged from Hiroshima. Powell's Noah does not hear the voice of God. He hears data. His ark is not built from wood and faith, but from steel equations and the panic of a civilization realizing it can erase itself. The parallels are deliberate. Earth is doomed. A small number are chosen. The rest are left behind, not because of sin, but because there isn't enough room. And the rocket launch is staged like a reversed Great Flood. The ocean rises below, fire erupts above, and humanity abandons the world it has already destroyed. So When Worlds Collide doesn't ask, how do we survive? It asks something far more uncomfortable: if we bring about the apocalypse ourselves, who has the right to board the ship? 19. Rejected by critics, redeemed by history. The first time I read the reviews of When Worlds Collide, I was genuinely shocked. The New York Times called the film cold, lacking human warmth. Other critics dismissed the idea of Earth's destruction as fanciful, almost ridiculous. To them, it was just a bleak flight of imagination, not serious cinema. But seen in the context of 1951, that reaction becomes sadly understandable. The world had just witnessed real atomic bombs. Fear in real life was already overwhelming. Audiences didn't want to be reminded that everything could end; they wanted to forget. And science fiction at the time was still regarded as the domain of pulp fiction, where every catastrophe could be neatly resolved with a heroic line of dialogue. The problem was that When Worlds Collide resolved nothing. The film offers no moral escape. There is only a countdown clock and people arguing as time runs out. Perhaps that is why it was rejected, not because it was wrong, but because it arrived too early. Decades later, when disaster films became a serious genre, audiences returned to When Worlds Collide and realized that almost every convention began here. Tsunamis engulfing cities, conference rooms full of disagreeing scientists, life or death decisions made in silence. 18. Filming in a race against time. There is a bitter irony in thinking about When Worlds Collide. A film about the end of the world was made under near-apocalyptic conditions itself. Paramount gave George Powell an almost unbelievable low budget and less than 4 weeks to shoot the entire live-action portion. Time on set passed as relentlessly as the countdown clock in the script. Actors worked 12-hour days with almost no rest. Sets were built and torn down continuously. Every shot had to count because there was no margin for error. Some days, the shooting schedule collapsed almost as quickly as Earth does in the film. The irony is that when filming wrapped, after exactly 27 days, everyone breathed a sigh of relief without realizing that the hardest part was still ahead. The effects in When Worlds Collide were not something that could be rushed. While the actors left the set, the effects team entered months of painstaking work with miniatures, matte paintings, hand-painted skies, fire smoke and water. Everything had to be done by hand. One small mistake could destroy an entire model. One fix meant another week of work. And that is what makes When Worlds Collide so special. It doesn't just tell a story about humanity fleeing the apocalypse. It was created by people who were themselves racing against time, trying to keep the film from collapsing before it could finish telling the story of the world's collapse. 17. A ship born of war. Do you remember the first time you saw the ship in When Worlds Collide? It doesn't have the romantic look of classic science fiction. It's heavy, crude and cold. That wasn't accidental. It was intentional. George Powell didn't draw inspiration for this vessel of salvation from comic books or space-age dreams. He looked to World War II, more specifically to the Nazi Phi-1 flying bomb, a weapon designed not to conquer, but to terrorize civilians. The design team studied every detail, the rough metal body, the violent exhaust flames, even the way the missile shudders as it comes to life. All of it was incorporated into the design of the Ark ship. The result is a vehicle that doesn't look like something meant to save people, but like something humans would build in a panic, functional, fast and dangerous. That creates a deeply uncomfortable paradox. The 20th century's Noah's Ark is born from the same lineage as tools of mass destruction. It doesn't erase war, it carries the scars of war with it into space. 16. The melting planet and the miniature world. There is a shared memory among most viewers of When Worlds Collide. The sense that Earth in the film is suffering, not exploding in a spectacular blaze, but melting slowly, as if the planet were being cooked from the inside. Long before CGI, the apocalypse of When Worlds Collide was created with wax heat and sheer risk. The effects team built massive wax models of Earth and the approaching planet Zer. They placed the models under heat lamps and industrial heaters, then filmed the melting process at high speed. When played back in slow motion, the wax shrank, cracked and flowed downward, looking uncannily like a dying world in space. The entire sequence was shot on a sealed soundstage, completely blacked out. Coloured gels backlighting smoke and layers of matte paintings were stacked to create the sense of cosmic fire and chaos. Every lightning bolt you see isn't digital, it's a hand-added layer of light applied one pass at a time. Earth doesn't die in a heroic instant. It oozes away slowly and irreversibly. And perhaps that's why the apocalypse in When Worlds Collide remains more haunting than many modern films. It doesn't give us excitement, it leaves us with helplessness. 15. A cast of unknowns. Do you remember the name of any actor the first time you watched When Worlds Collide? I don't. What I remember instead is the feeling that the people on screen were simply faces trying to stay calm as the world was about to end. It turns out that was intentional. When the film entered production, George Powell made a risky decision. He avoided stars altogether. In an era when Hollywood depended heavily on box office names, this was almost suicidal. But Powell understood one thing. If audiences saw movie stars, they would think of careers and fame. He wanted them to see themselves. Richard Durr, who played the lead scientist, was a Broadway actor nearly unknown to film audiences. Barbara Rush, cast as Joyce, had only a handful of minor roles. None of them carried any aura of celebrity. And that made the film far more frightening. When the world collapses, you don't see Hollywood heroes. You see ordinary people trying to understand what is happening, scientists fumbling with calculations, families staring at a lottery board realizing their names won't be called. There is no familiar face to cling to. It was a gamble, and Powell won. The anonymity makes When Worlds Collide feel more like a news report from the future than a piece of entertainment. The audience doesn't admire the characters, they replace them. 14. Shaking sets and real reactions. If there are moments in When Worlds Collide where the actors seem to lose their balance, staggering, grabbing onto objects, screaming because they can't stay upright, that's survival instinct. To make the audience feel the earth tearing itself apart, George Powell didn't simulate the motion. He made the ground actually move. Many major sets, such as the rocket facility and city interiors, were built on massive rolling platforms. During earthquake scenes, the crew used industrial poles and pulleys to violently shake the entire structure. What's unsettling is that many times the actors weren't warned in advance. You can see them grabbing tables and chairs, losing balance, shouting over the noise. Those reactions weren't scripted. Powell wanted authenticity, and he was willing to pay for it with tension on set. And perhaps that's why these scenes still unsettle viewers today. Not because they're loud, but because we recognize the truth. If the earth really shook, we would react exactly the same way. 13. A silent ending, a resounding question. There's something very strange about the ending of When Worlds Collide. It doesn't feel like an ending at all. When the survivors step onto the planet Zer, the first thing that envelops them is silence. Then a title card appears. The beginning. After everything floods fire extinction, the film doesn't say that humanity has been saved. It only says that things are beginning again. Nothing in the final scene suggests that humanity has learned its lesson. There is only a new world and the same people carrying all the memories of a dead Earth. This is especially haunting when viewed in the context of 1951, when audiences were still living under the shadow of the atomic bomb. The idea of starting over wasn't a hopeful fantasy, it was a very real question. If this world were destroyed, what would the survivors build next? And perhaps that's why the ending of When Worlds Collide still echoes today. Not because it offers hope, but because it isn't sure we deserve it. 12. Barbara Rush was cast, just 3 days before shooting. I've always remembered the image of Joyce Hendren in When Worlds Collide. She feels like a fragile anchor, the one thing keeping the film from tipping completely into despair. What's hard to believe is that Rush almost wasn't there at all. The role of Joyce Hendren was offered to 6 actresses. All of them turned it down. With the shooting schedule approaching and no female lead, Paramount panicked. They needed a face that could make audiences believe hope still existed, even if only for a moment. Then someone mentioned Barbara Rush. She was 23 years old, almost unknown. But when she walked into the reading room, George Powell needed only 10 minutes to know this was her. Rush didn't play Joyce as a damsel in distress or a scientist's daughter. She played her as a woman trying to hold on to the last traces of humanity as the world around her fell apart. She accepted the role on a Friday. By Monday, she was in front of the camera, and that urgency created exactly what Powell needed. Joyce doesn't look like someone prepared for the end of the world. She looks like someone thrown straight into it. 11. The tsunami scene that nearly drowned the crew. If there's one moment that makes When Worlds Collide feel like a true apocalypse, many would choose the tsunami scene. George Pal didn't want a cinematic wave. He wanted something that felt like a real disaster arriving, destroying, and continuing to destroy. To achieve this, the crew built an entire miniature Manhattan on stage 12. Tiny skyscrapers, bridges, streets, cars, everything prepared for a single shot. The plan was simple. Release 10,000 gallons of water from an overhead tank and let it crush the model city in one take. Cameras ready, lights checked, doors sealed. Then someone asked the question no one had considered. Where does the water go afterward? By then it was too late. The flood came down. It obliterated the perfect model. Water spilled off the platform, flooded the soundstage floor, soaked electrical cables. Lights short-circuited. Crew members scattered as water rose to their ankles. Someone shouted to cut the power before disaster struck. When it was over, they had the perfect shot and a wrecked soundstage. 10 Planet Zyra was painted on glass. The final moments of When Worlds Collide always feel like a dream. Planet Zer appears calm, pale, violet, unfamiliar, yet not threatening. It looks like a matte painting, and it is, but in a remarkably pure form. Chesley Bonestell, the legendary space artist, didn't paint Zer using multiple layered composites. He painted the entire new world on a single sheet of glass, 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide. 3 weeks for every brushstroke. Every colour was mixed to precisely match Technicolor. During filming, the glass was placed directly in front of the camera with the actors standing far behind it. Everything depended on perspective. If an actor was off position by even 6 inches, the illusion would completely collapse. And when the camera rolled, Barbara Rush walked down the slope, entered the frame and stopped at exactly the right spot. One painting, one actor, and absolute precision created cinematic magic in its most elemental form. 9. Larry Keating collapsed during the final scene. In When Worlds Collide, Dr. Cole Hendren is the man who always stands upright. He is the pillar of the Ark project, the mind keeping everything from falling apart before the world itself does. But during the final week of shooting, that upright figure began to falter in real life. Larry Keating was 54 at the time, a stage actor more accustomed to theatre lights than the chaos of a film set. The shooting schedule was brutal, 14-hour days, constant stoppages, due to effects issues repeated, takes that drained what little strength remained. Then came the final scene, the moment Hendren watches the Ark launch without him. Keating delivered his line, hit his mark, and then his knees buckled. He collapsed mid-take. The entire set rushed in. Someone called for a doctor. Keating was unconscious for nearly 2 minutes. They helped him into a chair, gave him water, waited about 20 minutes and tried again. This time Keating made it through. The exhaustion in Hendren's eyes in the final shot isn't acting. It's a man who has given everything, and on screen he has nothing left to hold on to. 8. The lottery scene was rewritten the night before filming. The lottery scene in When Worlds Collide was meant to be the heart of the film. 40 names are called, hundreds are left behind, but in the original script it didn't feel that way. Director Rudolph Matte read it and told George Pal bluntly, if the audience doesn't feel the weight of being left behind, every disaster that follows is meaningless. So the night before shooting, screenwriter Sidney Boehm sat in his hotel room and rewrote the entire scene in 4 hours. He added riots, he added pleading, he added the moment when the crowd realises this isn't chance, it's a death sentence. At 6 a.m, the new pages were delivered to the set. Actors received fresh script pages with their morning coffee. And when the cameras rolled, something strange happened. The crowd scenes, many filled with struggling actors paid $15 a day, didn't need to perform. They understood the feeling of being left behind. The chaos on screen wasn't choreographed. It rose out of real desperation. Mattei let the camera keep rolling because he knew some moments only happen once and can never be recreated. 7. The most terrifying moment isn't the tsunami, but the silence. In the first cut, Earth's final moments were filled with noise, screaming crowds, sirens, explosions. George Pal assumed that was what audiences expected. The apocalypse had to be loud. Composer Leith Stevens disagreed. He argued that the most frightening thing isn't sound, but the moment when all sound disappears, when humanity stops resisting and accepts the end. Pal was skeptical. Stevens recorded two versions, one with a full orchestra swelling to a climax, and one almost empty. Just wind, distant thunder. A faint piano note fading into nothing. They test-screened both. The loud version got applause. The quiet version left the audience frozen. Some people cried. Pal chose the silent version immediately. When the film was released, that became the scene people remembered most. The emptiness resonates like collective surrender, the sound of a world letting go. 6. A novel that sat on the studio shelf for 15 years. When Worlds Collide wasn't forgotten, it was stuck. Philip Wiley and Edwin Balmer wrote the novel in 1933, and Paramount bought the rights, immediately convinced it would become the next great disaster epic. But for more than a decade, the project existed only on paper. Production was announced in 1934, then again in 1936, then 1940. Each time it stalled at the same problem. No one knew how to convincingly film the end of the world with the technology of the time. Directors came and went. Screenwriters wrote and abandoned drafts. The script earned a reputation as a cursed apocalypse project. It wasn't until 1950, when the world was living with the reality of atomic fear, that science fiction became necessary. George Pal proved that impossible was really a matter of budget and resolve. Paramount dusted off the novel, handed it to Sidney Boehm and said, "Make it work." It took 17 years to travel from page to screen, but when it finally arrived, the world was ready to hear that story. 5. A $936,000 budget and the most expensive 12 minutes. George Pal was famous for knowing how to stretch a dollar. But when Worlds Collide pushed him to the limit, the money didn't go to actors or grand sets, it went into destruction. Miniatures $200,000, matte paintings $80,000. The flood sequence alone, nearly lethal to the crew, cost $95,000 in a single day. Paramount panicked and demanded cuts wherever possible, but Pal refused. He saved money everywhere else, reusing sets, shooting in single takes, cutting exterior scenes. But the 12 minutes of destruction stayed. When the film earned $3.5 million, no one asked anymore why those 12 minutes had been so expensive. 4. John Hoy played the villain without knowing his fate. Sidney Stanton is the film's most detestable character. A capitalist who buys his way onto the survival list while others are left behind. John Hoy played him perfectly and in total ignorance. The film was shot out of sequence. Hoy received only the pages containing his dialogue. No one ever gave him the full script. He asked George Pal, "Does Stanton survive? Does he redeem himself?" Pal just smiled and said, "You'll find out when you see the movie." So Hoy played every scene as a man fighting to survive, never knowing whether he would win. At the premiere, Hoy saw Stanton die on screen for the first time. He laughed, having spent 8 days performing a character who didn't make it to the end. 3. The rocket launch shot at 2 a.m. The Ark launch required darkness, smoke fire, and enough noise to wake an entire neighbourhood. The filming permit ran only until midnight. The crew began at 11 p.m, assuming 1 hour would be enough. The first take failed because of the smoke machine. The second failed because of wind. By 2 a.m, they were on take 7 and completely without a permit. That's when Powell decided to go all in. All lights on, maximum smoke, flames blasting 40 feet high. The rocket launched perfectly. Across the street, residents called the fire department thinking Paramount was on fire. 3 fire engines arrived before someone explained it was just a movie. Powell was fined $500 and had to apologize to the neighborhood. But the shot was perfect. 2. Banned for being too hopeless. When Worlds Collide was banned in Spain, Portugal and Ireland not for violence, but for the absence of God. All 3 censorship boards cited the same reason the film contains no divine intervention. Only cold science and mathematics deciding who lives and who dies. For deeply Catholic countries in the post-World War II era, that was unacceptable. Spain called the film an endorsement of existential despair. Portugal viewed it as morally corrosive. Ireland simply stamped it rejected. The bans lasted for years. But by 1962, when the film was screened again, the world had changed and that fear was no longer considered dangerous. 1. The sequel that never existed. George Powell always planned to make Afterworlds Collide a story about humanity rebuilding on a new planet. Fracturing over power, faith and survival under 2 suns. Concept art existed. A script was written. Paramount initially agreed. Then Conquest of Space 1955 failed. The studio pulled out. The project was cancelled. The script was filed away, then lost during an office cleanup. After Worlds Collide became one of Hollywood's most famous lost sequels, a future that was never allowed to begin. And perhaps that's fitting, because when Worlds Collide was never really about the future, it was about the moment before we know whether we deserve one. After all the melting images fade, the wax planets waves taller than cities, a ship leaving Earth in silence. When Worlds Collide leaves behind not awe, but a hollow space that's hard to name. It doesn't try to scare you with explosions. It frightens you with the idea that the apocalypse doesn't need monsters. It only needs humans to make enough wrong decisions. For you is When Worlds Collide, a story of hope or a warning we still refuse to listen to. If you enjoy film stories that aren't just about movies but about the people behind them, like this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss Hollywood's forgotten legacies.